Hi, everyone. I'm James Garbutt.
And I'm Denny Dumas.
And this is the Garbutt Dumas Real Estate Podcast.
Good morning, Jamie.
Good morning, Denny.
It's getting weird not seeing you every day.
I know, it's weird talking to you without seeing you.
Lots has changed, obviously, in real estate world in the last month and a half. One of those things being a new buyer waiver that is becoming more and more common. Lots of agents are having buyers and buyers' agents sign this document prior to showing a home. And I think it's important to read this form for both agents and buyers and try to understand what it means. So I've seen this form a number of times, been asked to sign it a number of times with buyers, and there's some liability here that I think we should touch on and I think people should be aware of prior to just freely signing this thing to get into a home. So I want to read the important section here, and then we can just kind of discuss what it means for buyers, what liability you are releasing. So, I mean, there's a lot in these forms, and they're all kind of different. This is just the most standard one that I've seen. There's a lot in here that is completely acceptable. Noting that you're going to stay 6 feet away from people, noting that you're not going to touch anything, noting that you'll use disinfectant wipes or hand sanitizer on the way in and out. But there's a waiver at the bottom that I'll read here. So it says, I agree to indemnify, save harmless, release, discharge, acquit, and forgive the seller, the real estate agent, and the real estate company, or any one of them, for any and all liability, claims, actions, suits, demands, costs, or expenses of every kind, including negligence arising from or related to my attendance at the premises, or any damage that occur as a result thereof. So, first of all, this waiver says nothing about COVID-19. But Jamie, why don't you just, after hearing that, why don't you just explain or talk about what potential risk this could have from a buyer signing this thing?
Maybe before we get into that last one, just regarding the COVID-19 comment, and I guess we can't generalize all forms, right? Because they're brokerage by brokerage dependent, correct?
Yeah.
Like that's not a real estate board form.
Yeah.
And so behind these forms are usually managing brokers that are keeping in mind limited liability. And it seems like they're, you got your managing broker hat on. A new form's coming out because of COVID. And in like one of the forms I'm looking, they do reference COVID-19 in the form.
Yeah.
But they also use this as an opportunity to try to get release their agents and the sellers of future liability that's not even tied to it. So when you say, for example, what is it? Indemnify, save harmless, release, discharge, acquit, forgive the seller and the real estate agent from any liability, claims, actions, suits, demands, costs, expenses of any kind, including negligence, and so on. So basically, if you fall down stairs that are not built to code, or you fall through the floor, or something falls on your head, or you get very sick due to mold inside of a home, or something like that, this is, to me, this feels like it's discharging you from other factors that typically a seller might be liable for. I mean, I have unfortunately been in an incident where someone's fallen downstairs in a showing, but fortunately it didn't lead to a lawsuit, but it could have. And right. In this case, if this form was signed, it might not, that might be waiving liability. Like I imagine if you go bungee jumping or jump out of an airplane, so. Okay. So, I don't know. I think it's a bit excessive. I think I get why they're doing it. Any chance a managing broker can limit liability for their people makes sense. But, it's kind of, it's like saying we have COVID now. But if anything happens when you're doing that showing, regardless of who's at fault, regardless of, whether it's safe or not, but you can't go back to the seller or the listing agent. It's a bit much, man.
It's a
So
lot. And I think that, like, I think a lot of people aren't even reading them. A lot of buyer's agents aren't reading them. A lot of agents aren't explaining what this actually means to the buyer prior to getting them to sign it. So how would you explain this to a buyer who, home comes up for sale, they absolutely love it, they want to go see it? How do you explain this form to them?
well, I think you acknowledge that it's excessive, but you also have to acknowledge whether they have a choice or not. It's completely up to the listing agent to decide who sees a home. And right now, with low supply, I mean, if you're looking at products that there's not much of, a lot of detached homes or certain condos in areas, there are low supply out there for certain segments. You have to decide if you're a buyer and willing to take on the risk. I mean, from a practical standpoint, I've never had a buyer sue a seller or listing agent over something that arose from a showing, and I've never been on the other end of it. So I guess from a likelihood perspective, it's a low likelihood that something would happen. But from a liability perspective, you don't have you may be signing away any last sort of like any sort of last foot to stand on if something does happen. Right. So I think the way that I'd explain it to a buyer is it's excessive, it's ridiculous, it's I understand the logic behind it from a liability point of view, but this covers beyond the normal expectations from like a COVID or pandemic risks. But if you want to see that home, and there aren't many others out there, it's a low risk that has a low likelihood of amounting to anything. So it's up to you. It's really up to the buyer. And right now, if I were a buyer and I were looking for a home and there weren't any available, I mean, quite frankly, I would just sign it if I didn't have a choice. And I hate saying that, but the reality is, if you want to see a house, odds just don't be safe. Don't fall down. Hold the railings. Be very, very safe. But I've just never been in a lawsuit like this, so I think the likelihood is so low that yes, there's a risk there, but it's a very low one.
The one thing that kind of, well, first, like a couple things that kind of rub me the wrong way about this type of term is, one, it doesn't mention COVID-19. So the purpose of having these forms out there, the purpose of these managing brokers developing these forms is to protect liability from a seller, from an agent regarding the spread of COVID-19. And it doesn't say anything about that. The other thing is, there's no cutoff date. Yeah, go ahead.
There's no COVID-19 mentioned in that area, like in that part of the form. But if we're reading the same form here, there is, it says, I'm entering a premises voluntarily by my own free without any coercion by any person or company, or being fully aware that we're in the midst of COVID-19 virus pandemic. And the virus appears to be highly contagious. I understand entering into or on the premises, I may be exposing myself to potential transmissions of the COVID-19 virus to myself, family, or friends. Knowingly, freely, and voluntarily accept inherent risks of this activity, including possible contamination, illness, and death. So there is we should acknowledge that there is some sort of wording around taking on the risks of that during this time. It's just at the end when they talk about indemnify, release, discharge, acquit, forgive. That has nothing to do with COVID-19, and that's where the worst part of the form is. So, I just wanted to clarify that. But you're right; there is no end date to this. It's open.
So, I guess how do we, like, the one thing I've done to protect some buyers, and I've just had this conversation, if they're uncomfortable signing it, I suggest this adjustment, is just adding something at the bottom saying, this term, this clause will be open for the property showing on X and X date only.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And of course, my thought on signing it versus not signing it, if you can narrow down or edit the form and the listing agent's okay with that to narrow down specifically to the showing date, I think that's absolutely. Having something open-ended like this technically means, in theory, it could mean that anytime you see the property, if you get an accepted offer, you go back for inspection. If you have multiple exposures to a property, this form might, apply, like the way it naturally is written, applies to, ongoingly every time you're in the property, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I wonder how this might affect, or it may conflict terms of an offer in some cases, or it may it may potentially come back on a buyer if they buy a place and you there's some negligence involved, or who knows, Denny. I mean, there could be some scenarios I'm not thinking of here that because you sign this form, it conflicts with a contract in some way and restricts your ability to go back on a seller down the road when you should be able to in normal circumstances. I mean, is that how you read this?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's my point of adding some sort of little extra term at the end, just stating that this applies for this specific property showing on this date only.
How have you been reading? I mean, how have realtors? We've gone through a few different forms from a few different brokerages. How are you finding realtors? I mean, are you seeing some are very sticky on this and some are loose, or is it all over the map? Are some forms worse than others? Have you seen much?
This is kind of the standard one the one that I read is kind of the standard that I've seen multiple times, and like this exact same version. I don't think realtors really know what it means, and they think they have to do this. Like they think their managing broker has told them in order to show a property, you are required to get this form signed, which I don't think is true. But a lot of people just don't want to, regardless of how negative this form is and could be in the future. I think a lot of people just don't want to fight it. Like I had a conversation with a listing agent over the weekend that I showed a property to a buyer, and I got there a few minutes early and was just chatting with him outside and said, like, how ridiculous are these forms? Because he had them there, this exact term. And he said, dude, I stopped fighting the world a long time ago. He's like, I'm told to do this, so I'm just doing it. He's like, I don't agree with it. I don't want to sign it myself, but I was told I have to do this.
There's been a lot of forms added to our life over the past few years. I really hope this is the one that goes away, but they keep seemingly adding them and they don't seem to go away. They just keep coming on. But I'd like to hope that this is a form that is temporary, because if this becomes a new norm in some way, it's unfortunate. There's definitely, basically listing agents are baiting buyers that want to see their listings as an opportunity to release any liability that may come back on them down the road. Yeah. And, if it was a buyer's market, I think there'd be a little less power from the listing agent. But right now we're still experiencing a lower supply for a lot of products. And when there's low supply and there's buyers that exist looking for them, there's a strong motivation there to get into a property. And if the equation isn't in the buyer's favor, you don't have a lot of power. So I think your suggestion to edit the form in a way that just applies to that specific showing date, so it limits the liability in some way. I think that's a great suggestion. It's I don't know, Denny. I imagine we'll have to get used to these forms over the coming months, but when the market picks up, I think it's going to be a challenge to get these things signed every time you want to see a property.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. I think that's enough. The point of this story and the reason that I wanted to chat about this with you was really just to bring it to agents' attention that we should be reading and understanding forms before just blindly asking other clients to sign them. And from a client perspective, just to point out exactly what it means to be signing this form prior to going into a showing.
Absolutely. And from a buyer's perspective, you have to decide if you want to take the risk. Right. And, if you sit and wait, I don't blame you. If you take the risk, I don't blame you. So that's it, Denny.
All right. Beauty.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.